Welcome and thanks for joining me for lesson number 2 from the topic Insights for Surviving FCS, Forced Confinement Situation. My name is Sam Jones and I'm honored to share these insights with you. It is my prayer and hope during this unusual time that these insights will aid you and your spouse in helping you to enrich your marriage. My objective for each lesson is twofold. Number one, to suggest 2 new insights for surviving FCS, and number 2, to offer an exercise with each insight that you can implement to strengthen your marriage. Hopefully you remember the first 2 insights from lesson number 1, but if not, allow me to briefly mention insight number 1 and insight number 2. Number 1, be willing to change, adapt, or adjust. Studies on marital happiness report healthy marriages have spouses who are able and willing to change or adapt when they are confronted with an unexpected or an expected situation or circumstance in life. So, if you want your marriage to be a blessing, then be willing to change. Be willing to adapt to the situation. Look at what changes you need to make in your life to make your marriage better. Insight number 2, be willing to laugh or spend more time smiling at each other. Remember the words of Solomon in Proverbs chapter 17 and verse number 22. Proverbs 17 and verse number 22, Solomon says, "A merry heart does good like medicine." What Solomon is saying, laughter is good for your health, but laughter is also good for your marriage. So, during this FCS, this forced confinement situation, you and your spouse need to spend a little more time laughing together. Now, let's go to insight number 3. Be willing to think before you speak. Be willing to think before you speak. Some couples during this forced confinement situation are speaking rather before they think. Some couples are speaking before they think. And my challenge is during this unusual time, couples need to be extremely cautious and very careful in what they say to one another. The importance of our words in a marital relationship, the importance of our words to one another, clearly seen in what Solomon says in Proverbs 18 and verse number 21. Turn there. Proverbs chapter 18, verse number 21. Listen to what Solomon says. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Our spoken words can give life or joy to our marriage, or our spoken words can destroy or rob our marriage of happiness. So, think before you speak. Concerning the tongue, consider the words of James. In the book of James, chapter 3, look at what James says in verse number 4. James says, "Look also at ships. Although they are so large, they are driven by fierce winds. They are turned by a small rudder wherever the pilot desires." In this text, James compares a ship without a rudder to a person with an untamed tongue. The ship without a rudder will eventually damage itself, and a spouse with an untamed tongue will get himself or herself in a lot of trouble. So, to avoid trouble in your marriage, tame your tongue. To avoid trouble in your marriage, think before you speak. Be careful. Be very careful what you say to your spouse during this FCS. Not only be careful what you say, be careful how you say it. You see, the tone of what you say is equally as important as the words you say. So be careful how you say and what you say to your spouse. Healthy relationships are governed by tamed tongues. Is your tongue tamed or is your tongue untamed? So while you and your spouse are experiencing your FCS, consider taming your tongue. Again, let's go to the book of James. James chapter 3, look at what James says in verses 5 and 6. James says, an untamed tongue is like a fire. An untamed tongue can burn down, in verse number 5, he says, a forest. And he goes on to say an untamed tongue can destroy a person's body in hell. If an untamed tongue can do these two things, an untamed tongue can destroy your marital relationship. So, don't allow your marriage to be damaged. Don't allow your marital happiness to be destroyed by an untamed tongue. Think before you speak. Be careful what you say to one another. Think before you speak. If what you're about to say in your marriage, if it's not going to strengthen the marriage, keep the words to yourself. If it's not going to make your marriage stronger, keep the words to yourself. Remember the words of Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. He says, let no corrupt communication, let no corrupt words come out of your mouth. In other words, what Paul is saying, if what you're about to say in your marriage, if it's not going to enhance, if it's not going to make your marriage richer, consider keeping those words to yourself. Look in Proverbs again. The chapter is 15. Look at the importance of words or our tongue and Proverbs 15 and verse number 4. Solomon says, kind words are like a life-giving tree. Kind words. Sweetheart, baby, I love you. I am so thankful that I'm married to you. Kind words are like a life-giving tree. So, give your marriage life. How can you give your marriage life? Think before you speak. Now, here's an exercise to implement this week for this insight. Practice saying positive things to each other throughout the day. Practice saying positive things to each other throughout the day. And start each statement with honey, sweetheart, baby. You see, that sets the tone for what you're about to say. Honey, I would love a piece of your lemon pie. Honey, I would love whatever. You see, you're more likely to get what you request if you set the tone right. And so, to enrich your marriage during this FCS, think before you speak. Insight number 4. Be willing to view your marriage as a blessing. Be willing to view your marriage as a blessing. When things happen in your life, good or bad, are you able to see the glass as half full, or do you see the glass as half empty? When things happen in your life, whether good or bad, are you able to see the glass as half full or half empty? That is, do you see the positive side of things, or do you see immediately the negative side of things? Practice seeing the positive side of things in your life, and especially in your marriage. Concentrate and dwell on the positive things, not on the negative things. Your perspective will shape your reaction. Your perspective will shape your response to life situations. So learn to see the glass half full. Learn to see the positive side of your marriage. To keep your marital satisfaction above 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, it is absolutely imperative. It is absolutely important that you see your marriage as a blessing, that you see your marriage as a gift from God. Do you see it? Do you view your marriage as a gift from God? It will shape the way you interact. It will shape the way you respond to situations in your marriage. There's a famous sociological theorem authored by one of my favorite sociologists, Dr. W.I. Thomas, that is worthy for us to think about with this insight. Thomas states this: if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Let me state it again. Dr. Thomas says this: if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. In short, this means that people and spouses define and respond to situations based on their perspective. And then their perspective create consequences for them. So, simply, the way you see things, the way you define things will influence your behavior, will influence your mindset. So, how do you view your spouse? How do you see her? How do you see him? How do you view your marriage? You see, if you view your marriage in a positive way, you're more likely to respond in a positive way to disagreements. But if you view your marriage in a negative way, you're more likely to respond negatively when there are problems in your marriage. You're more likely to change things about yourself and things that are necessary for you to change about your marriage if you view your marriage in a positive perspective. Again, I ask you, how do you view your marriage? How do you view your spouse? Do you view her as a gift from God? Do you view your husband as a gift from God? I want you to consider 2 passages from the book of Proverbs about marriage. 2 passages from the book of Proverbs about marriage. The first, turn to Proverbs chapter 18. Look at verse 22. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22. Listen to Solomon. He who finds a wife, who finds a spouse or husband, finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. In short, a good spouse is a sign that God is blessing you. It's what Solomon is saying. And what you need to do is view your marriage, your spouse, as a gift or a blessing from God. He who finds a wife, finds a husband, finds a good thing. It is a blessing from God. It's a gift from God. So, how do you see your wife? How do you see your husband? Do you view your marriage as a blessing or a curse from God? Proverbs chapter 19. Look at verse 14. Proverbs 19, verse 14. Solomon says these words: houses and riches are inheritance from our fathers or parents, but a prudent wife, a prudent husband is from the Lord. A good wife, a good husband is a gift from God. Again, I ask you, how do you view your marriage? Your perspective will influence the way you respond to disagreements, the way you respond to situations in your marriage. Those couples who view their marriage as a blessing, as a gift from God, are more likely to survive a storm. Those couples who view their marriage as a gift from God are more likely to be able to manage an unexpected situation like FCS, forced confinement situation. Now, let me suggest an exercise that you can implement to help strengthen your marriage concerning insight number 4. Start each day by thanking God for your husband or your wife. Start each day. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, thank God for your husband or your wife. And at least 3 times a day, throughout the day, look at your wife or say to yourself, thank God for my husband. Thank God for my wife. And sometime throughout the day, sit down and assess with your spouse how you're doing on insight number 4. May God bless your marriage during this FCS, this forced confinement situation. Until next week, put into practice these 2 insights. Number 3, think before you speak. And number 4, view your marriage as a blessing, as a gift from God. May God bless you to have an enjoyable day.